My name is Arya. I am 20 tonight in our Los Angeles home, and while the lights were warm and friends laughed around the cake, I kept watching the corner where my brother sat and the way my mother fixed the flowers without meeting my eyes. They raised their glasses, teased me about being old enough to order drinks legally, asked about college, about plans for the future. Their words came with warmth, but the air seemed divided as if laughter filled only half the room, leaving the other half caught in silence. My knees felt weak, but I stood tall, the letter still clutched in my hand. The rain continued to fall, relentless, soaking me through, but I hardly felt it anymore. My heart was beating too loudly, urging me forward. I turned toward the car, my voice raw from crying but firm. The driver's eyes met mine through the open window. "Take me to him," I said quietly, though the steadiness in my tone surprised even me. For the first time that night, the driver's expression shifted. His lips pressed into a thin line, then curved ever so slightly into something between relief and resolve. He gave a single nod. As I slid into the seat, still clutching the letter, I knew that whatever awaited me ahead would change everything. My life was no longer suspended in questions. The answers and the truth of who I was lay just beyond this moment. The car rolled away from the rain-soaked street, its tires humming steadily against the pavement. I sat in silence, clutching the damp letter against my chest, the paper already softened from the storm. Each mile carried me further from the life I had known and closer to the truth I had both feared and longed for. My heart wavered between anticipation and dread, beating too quickly for me to steady. Outside the window, neighborhoods passed in quiet darkness, the glow of porch lights and shuttered windows blurring into one long ribbon of shadows. The driver, Henderson, kept his eyes on the road. His presence was calm, unspoken, but I felt it like an anchor. Once or twice he glanced at me in the mirror, his gaze steady as though he sensed the storm of thoughts turning over in my head. I pressed the letter tighter against me. It was the only proof I had, yet it asked me to believe in something larger than paper and ink. As the skyline of San Francisco emerged through the mist, the car turned onto a long, winding drive lined with trees whose branches swayed in the wet night air. At the top of the hill stood a large house, windows bright against the dark. My chest tightened. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but the car was already slowing to a stop. The tires crunched on gravel. Henderson put the car into park and looked at me once more. No words passed between us, but his slight nod urged me forward. I pushed the door open. Each time I looked across the table, I saw Victor's stillness, and it cut through the joy like a knife resting close without touching. Inside, I kept wishing he would leave it alone just for this night. Cold night air rushed in, biting my damp clothes. My shoes sank slightly into the muddy ground, each step heavier than the last, as I approached the wide front door. It opened before I could knock. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. Time had written soft lines at the corners of his eyes, but those eyes, clear and bright, stopped me cold. They were the same eyes I had stared at in the mirror every morning of my life. The same eyes from the photograph inside the envelope. For a moment I could not breathe. My lips parted, but no sound came until a question broke free, trembling in the night air. "Who are you really?" I asked. He did not rush to answer. Instead, his expression softened and a faint, hesitant smile appeared. Reaching into his coat, he drew out a second envelope thicker than the one I carried and a stack of worn photographs. His hands trembled slightly as he held them out. "Arya?" He said my sister, my little sister. Hearing my name in his mouth made something inside me falter. I took the photos with hands that shook more than I wanted him to see. The top one showed a child in a summer dress, hair sticking out in every direction, grinning in the arms of a young man whose face was full of joy. That child was me. The man, the same eyes, and the same tilt of a smile was standing in front of me now. A flood of memory surged forward. I was small again, climbing into the lap of someone whose arms felt steady and warm. I remembered laughter, the warmth of a hand ruffling my hair, a presence that felt like safety. Then the emptiness that followed the years of being told I did not belong, the silence that had never offered an explanation. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. The envelope slipped from my fingers to the ground as I stumbled forward. drawn by something beyond reason or fear. I fell into his arms, burying my face against his shoulder, sobs breaking loose after years of holding them in. He held me tightly, his body trembling just as much as mine. After a long moment, when the first shock had eased enough for words, he spoke quietly. "They kept you from me," he whispered. "Victor made sure no one knew where you were. He wanted everything for himself." The name he used sounded both familiar and new. I pulled back enough to look at him, my vision blurred but steady. His face held grief and a kind of weary relief. I searched his features and then understood what I had not before. The name Marlowe I had heard once in a whisper belonged to him. That he would not say the things I had come to fear, that he would not mark this day with his disapproval, his disdain. Even silence from him would be a kind of mercy. But the silence he kept was not neutral. He was Michael Marlowe, the brother my mother had almost never spoken about. He saw the question in my eyes and nodded slowly. "My father's name had been Marlowe," he said, "and after the separation he had kept his name and his search quiet. I did not know the details," he continued, "but he had been looking for me for years. He had hired people, followed threads, and at last found the trail that led to me. He called me Michael because that was what he used, and Marlowe was his family name. It was the missing thread my childhood had hinted at." Anger rose quick and hot, braided with relief. How could this have been kept from me? I thought, how could they have let a life go unspoken in the same house where I grew up? His arms around me were steady, and I wanted to ask everything and say nothing all at once. He pulled back a little and held the photos out again. "Look," he said softly, pointing to a picture of him holding me as a baby, the two of us framed in sunlight. I traced the worn edges with my thumb. I saw not only the past, but the intention behind the search, the persistence that had not let go for years. When he spoke of Victor, his voice did not harden into accusation so much as strain with the effort of what had been discovered. He told me how documents had been hidden, how names had been changed, how pieces of a life were nudged out of reach. Listening, I felt the shape of a plan that had been set in motion without me, a plan that had made me small in my own home. The joy of finding him tangled immediately with the bitterness of what had been taken. I thought of the bag at my feet that night, of the way my mother had looked away when questions pried at her. He searched my face as if trying to read whether I would be able to carry the truth. "This was not an ending," he said quietly. "It is only the beginning." Outside rain slid down the windows in steady sheets. Inside his arms I felt both warmth and a chill. The reunion had given me something I had not known how to ask for, and at the same time it confirmed that there was work ahead, papers to be found, ties to be mended, the life I had been denied to be told honestly. I let him hold me a little longer, letting the moment settle. When I finally stepped back, the photograph still warm in my hand, I felt a fragile balance shift inside me. The past had made a small, undeniable space for the future. This meeting did not resolve everything, but it had given me a name and a place to begin. It had the weight of a storm gathering, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes breathing uneven. I remembered birthdays from when I was younger. The living room was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to absorb every breath. A golden light from the chandelier fell over the framed portraits that lined the wall, generations of faces frozen in moments of pride and belonging. I sat on the edge of a leather sofa, my palms damp against my knees. On the coffee table before me lay a stack of thick folders, their weight visible in the way they pressed into the polished wood. My brother Michael slid them toward me with a firm push. His eyes held both sorrow and resolve, as though he had rehearsed this moment yet still struggled to bear its weight. I reached for the nearest folder. The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust. My fingers trembled as I opened it, each page covered in legal terms that blurred together until Michael's voice guided me through. His tone was steady, but every word seemed to scrape at an old wound. When Mom and Dad passed, he began their shares in the company, their investments, their estate. It was all supposed to be held in trust for you until you turned 20. He paused, glancing at me to be sure I was following. But Victor took advantage of Mom when she was at her weakest. He pressured her into signing away rights she barely understood. I stared at him, not fully grasping. She signed them away. Just like that. Michael's jaw tightened. She was grieving. She wasn't herself. And Victor presented it as a safeguard, a temporary arrangement until you were of age. But he drafted documents that stripped you of your inheritance entirely. The words sank in slowly like stones falling into deep water. My chest constricted. I remembered Victor's sharp glances, his voice laced with contempt. The memory of my birthday returned the sting of humiliation when he threw a bag at my feet and announced I had nothing. At the time, I thought it was cruelty born of hatred, but now I saw it for what it truly was calculated. He had wanted me erased not out of anger, but out of greed. I felt my throat burn. So all this time, it wasn't just hatred. He planned it. Michael nodded, his gaze steady. Though his hand on the armrest tightened until his knuckles whitened, he hid your existence from the rest of our family. If they had known, if they had asked questions, he couldn't have gotten away with it. He made sure no one knew where you belonged. I leaned back, my body heavy yet restless inside. The cheap balloons tied to chairs, the small presents wrapped clumsily by my mother, her eyes shining with hope that the day would make me forget whatever tension filled the house. Back then, Victor still came, still ate a slice of cake, but even then there had been distance. The room swayed with memories. Victor's mocking words, his disdainful eyes the moment he exiled me into the storm as if I were nothing. A hollow laugh escaped me, bitter and short. I thought it was personal, I whispered almost to myself. I thought it was just me he hated. Michael shook his head, his voice low. It was never just you. It was everything you represented. The inheritance, the connection to Dad's legacy. He wanted it all without question. For a long moment, silence stretched between us. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. My chest rose and fell unevenly. Rage tightening every muscle, grief pressing into the edges of it. Then suddenly the phone on the side table rang. Its shrill tone cut through the quiet like a blade. Michael reached for it, his shoulders squared, and pressed the receiver to his ear. "Robert," he said, his voice shifting as recognition settled in. I listened intently, my heart still thundering. The voice of my uncle, our family's lawyer, came through the line, calm yet unyielding. "I still have the originals," Robert said firmly, his voice crackling through the line. "Proof that Victor forged signatures. Documents that show your mother was misled. We can take this back to court. We can expose him." My eyes locked on Michael's face as he absorbed the words. A flicker of hope crossed his features, quickly shadowed by the gravity of what lay ahead. He turned his gaze to me, his lips pressing together before speaking. "You heard him," he said softly. "We have a way." The fire inside me, already kindled, flared higher. The humiliation, the rejection, the years of silence, they all converged into something sharper, something steadier. My hands curled into fists on my lap nails, biting into skin. I lifted my chin, meeting Michael's eyes. The girl who had been cast out in the rain on her birthday was still inside me, bruised and trembling. But alongside her now stood someone else, someone who would not shrink, not this time. "I won't let him take any more," I said quietly, but the firmness in my voice filled the room. Michael nodded once, relief softening his features. The bond between us, fragile only hours ago now, felt unshakable. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch us, silent witnesses to the vow I had just spoken. I reached for the folders again, but this time my hands were steady. I was no longer just the discarded girl with nothing. I was the rightful heir, and I would reclaim not only what was mine, but the dignity Victor had tried so carefully to strip away. That night, as Michael and I sat with Uncle Robert in the dim study going over stacks of legal files, my phone vibrated on the table. A glance too sharp, a word too clipped, a gesture that felt more like tolerance than affection. I had told myself it didn't matter that siblings fought, that families had cracks. Tonight, though, those cracks felt wide enough to swallow me whole. The sound was small but sharp, cutting through the quiet murmur of papers being shifted. I glanced down and saw an unfamiliar number. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something inside me whispered that I had to answer. I pressed it to my ear, my hands suddenly clammy. On the other end, a woman's voice trembled. "Arya, I need to meet you. I know things about Victor." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I searched for words but only managed a faint, cautious reply. "Who are you?" The line went silent except for a shaky breath. Then the woman whispered, "Someone who has nothing left to lose." We arranged to meet the next afternoon at a small cafe near the San Francisco Pier. The hours in between dragged heavily. My thoughts circled restlessly, replaying her voice, weighing possibilities. Was this a trap Victor had set, or a lifeline fate had placed before me? The next day, rain clung to the air, soft but persistent, leaving the streets slick. The cafe was nearly empty, the scent of coffee lingering in the corners. She was already there when I arrived, sitting near the window with her hands wrapped tightly around a cup that had long gone cold. Her posture was weary, her eyes swollen as if from many sleepless nights. I slid into the seat across from her. She lifted her gaze slowly, and I saw a shadow of beauty still etched in her tired features. Her voice cracked when she began. "My name is Sarah. I was with Victor for years." The words hung in the air. My pulse quickened. She leaned down and pulled a manila envelope from her bag, her fingers trembling as she set it on the table between us. "I kept these," she said. "At first I thought I could protect him, or maybe protect myself. But he left me with nothing but shame. I can't carry it anymore." I hesitated before sliding the envelope closer. My hands tingled as I unfastened it. Inside were photocopies of contracts, financial statements, and something that made my breath catch, a deed bearing my mother's name, her signature uneven, almost childlike at the bottom. Sarah's voice lowered, heavy with regret. "He forced her. She wasn't in any state to understand, and he put the papers in front of her anyway." I watched it happen. I didn't stop him. My chest tightened. I felt anger flare toward her, the kind that wanted to accuse, to condemn. Yet as I looked at her trembling hands and her face that bore years of quiet torment, the anger gave way to something more complex. She was not his accomplice in strength. She had been his pawn in weakness. "Why now?" I asked, my voice more brittle than I intended. The music from a small speaker filled the room softly, a pop song about love and growing older. One of my friends leaned in, laughing, her breath warm with the scent of soda. "Make a wish," she whispered as the candles burned lower. She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Because he destroyed me too. I lost my job. My family turned away when they learned the truth. He promised me security, but when things got difficult, he erased me as easily as he erased you. I can't let him keep standing while we're all in ruins." Her words pierced deeper than I expected. For the first time, I saw not just Victor's betrayal of me, but the trail of broken lives he left behind. She pushed the envelope fully toward me, her hand lingering there. "Take it. Do what I couldn't. End this." I opened the file again and stared at the pages. There it was, undeniable proof of fraud, of coercion. My mother's name twisted into ink she hadn't willingly given. My body trembled, every nerve alive. This was what we had been missing, the final piece that made everything clear. I raised my eyes to Sarah. She seemed lighter, as if unburdened by finally letting go. There was no triumph in her, only a tired release. When I left the cafe, the rain had shifted to a mist, a fine drizzle that clung to my hair and skin. The streets glistened under the muted glow of street lamps. I clutched the envelope against my chest, feeling its weight not only as paper but as justice waiting to be spoken aloud. I tilted my head upward, the gray sky heavy above me. In the quiet of my own thoughts, words formed silently. This time, Victor would not escape. His empire, built on lies and coercion, was about to crumble. I walked up the small path to the 2-story house in Los Angeles and felt the rhythm of my steps before I felt anything else. The porch light was on, though it was late, and the door opened with a sound I remembered from nights when sleep came in fits. Inside the living room smelled faintly of old coffee and something floral that belonged to another time. Photographs lined the wall, and their faces were still the kind of stillness that makes you notice how little people change and how much they pretend not to notice it. My mother sat on the edge of the sofa with a thin robe wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands gripped the fabric at her knees, and her fingers left pale marks where the cloth was pinched. I set a manila folder on the coffee table and let the weight of it land like a deliberate step. The papers had been copies of bank records and emails, and a signed statement from a neighbor who had seen things that night. Later, I would think about the precise order I had chosen to put them in, as if arrangement could help the facts stand straighter. I closed my eyes for a moment, tried to summon something simple peace, belonging a year where I wouldn't feel like a stranger under my own roof. When I opened my eyes again, everyone had begun to clap. They urged me to blow out the candles, so I did. For the moment, I watched my mother look at the folder and then away. Her eyes were wet, but she did not reach for my hand. She had the look people get when they are thinking about saying something and then decide the words are too heavy to drop into a room. I asked her if what he had said was true, and if she had been forced to stay quiet. She began to cry quietly, a small sound that did not fill the room. She did not deny anything, and she did not try to explain. She kept her hands where they were and let the tears come without making a show of them. That silence that followed felt like an answer of its own. Footsteps came down the staircase like a second pulse. Victor appeared in a dark suit that fit him the way a role fits an actor. He moved with a kind of smooth confidence, the kind made by years of deciding how other people should stand. He looked at me and I felt the old assessment again, the measurement I had felt since I was young. He asked me why I was back and then added that if I thought I could rely on our mother I should forget it, because everything was his now. His voice carried a casual certainty that what he said would be accepted without question. I stood up straighter than I felt, and I said that this had to stop. I said that I had documents and witnesses. I said that he would be held to account. My voice trembled in the beginning and then steadied. Saying the facts out loud made them heavier in my mouth. He slammed his hand on the table and the coffee cup jumped. The sound was not loud, but it made the room align itself around a new edge. He reached toward my mother and placed his hand on her shoulder. The touch stayed there in a way that seemed meant to remind her who was in control of the room. She bowed her head and did not look up. The gesture was small and precise, and it did what such gestures often do, which is to claim a presence without speaking. I moved forward and met his gaze. I said that if he ever treated her like that again, I would do everything in my power to make sure he answered for it. I chose words that were about process and consequence, rather than about taking something from him. The point was to make clear that there were ways to make wrongs visible. He laughed a short sound that did not reach his eyes, and then smiled with the kind of tight smile people use when they think a challenge will evaporate. For a moment I noticed a flicker in his face, a slight slackening like something reconsidering its footing, and I took a breath that felt like a small claim. He let go of my mother and backed away. He said something about being careful and left the room. The flames died in a puff of smoke, and for a moment the room felt united, lighthearted. Cheers and laughter rippled, my name echoed. I let myself smile, hoping maybe the night would pass without what I dreaded. But then the sound I had been waiting for came. The click of the front door felt terminal and small at the same time. After he left, I sat next to my mother and held her hand against my palm. Her skin was cool, but not cold. She folded her hands together like someone practicing a small ritual. The house had its usual sounds, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, distant traffic like a steady background current. Those ordinary noises made the moment feel less like a scene in a story and more like life catching up to itself. My mind went back to the afternoon of my 20th birthday. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a slice of cake that tasted faintly of frosting and too much attention. Victor had stood across from me and said that I was not his real sister. Du liu jia din. The sentence landed without flourish, and the room reorganized itself around that comment as if it were a fact that needed no proof. I remember how I had looked down at my hands and the way my fingers found the edge of the table. I left town after that, quiet and steady in my steps, telling myself I would learn how to shape a life that did not need his approval. The folder on the table held the small details that added up. There was a bank transfer that did not match any account I had known about. There were emails that started polite and then slid into instructions. There was the neighbor's statement with a timestamp. Each page, when I watched it closely, felt like a tiny push toward a truth I had not allowed myself to look at before. It felt less like a vindictive act and more like putting the pieces of a story where they could be read. I think what surprised me most was not the documents themselves, but the way they changed how the room felt. The photographs on the wall, the mugs in the cabinet, the chair by the window that had a faint impression where someone always sat. They began to seem less like background and more like assembled testimony. That is not an accusation of objects. It is simply that once you take the steps to show what you know, you start to notice how things have been arranged for a long time. When Victor paused on the front steps, I saw him look back at us. For an instant, there was a shadow in his face that had not been there before. He did not hurry, but his step lost some of its assuredness. He closed the door, and the sound of it was final enough for me to feel it in my chest. I did not feel triumphant. I felt calibrated. There was a steadier space inside me where earlier there had been only reaction and memory. A chair scraped against the wooden floor, loud, abrupt cutting through the laughter. My body tensed before I even looked. I already knew. Victor stood, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. Every conversation hushed, every eye turned toward him. My mother and I sat together in that steadiness. She began to speak in fits and starts, saying small things about how she had been afraid and how she had thought the silence was the only way to keep us whole. She did not ask for forgiveness, and she did not make grand explanations. She offered quiet regret the way someone might offer a cup of tea, acknowledging something necessary without dramatics. I told her that telling the truth was not a betrayal, but a way to draw a clearer line for what comes next. There was no neat resolution in the room that night. The folder was still on the table, and the papers were not magic. The path ahead would require conversations, appointments, and paperwork, and perhaps some people deciding they could not be part of what would follow. But the first part had been done, and in doing that I felt a shift. It was not the kind of change that erases history. It was the kind that allows you to hold your own name without flinching. I thought about how dignity can be measured in small, regular acts. I thought about coming back and sitting at that table and setting down the folder as a way of marking a boundary. I thought about a younger me who had let other people write the margins of her life, and about the person now who could speak facts calmly and insist on being heard. There was a quiet confidence that had taken root, not loud or dramatic, but steady enough to see the work ahead. Outside the house, the city went on in its usual rhythm. Inside, there was a different sort of quiet one that felt like an unspoken agreement to do what needed doing. I folded the papers back into the folder and closed it with care. My mother squeezed my hand, and then released it, and then rested her head against the back of the sofa like someone allowing a small rest. For the first time in a long while, I saw in her face a readiness to be known without pretense. We did not speak about what would happen tomorrow. We left the next steps unnamed. There was an unspoken plan made of small promises and practical acts. That evening had not settled everything, but it had changed the shape of what living in that house meant for us. I left feeling the steady, manageable weight of a life that was beginning to reorder itself around clearer facts and softer truths. The change was not dramatic. It was the kind that arrives in small measures and is built on repeated, honest decisions. I walked away from the house and kept my steps measured in a way I had not allowed myself to before. The morning of the hearing arrived with a gray sky over downtown Los Angeles. I walked into the courthouse with my brother beside me, wishing for one easy night as the silence at the table grew heavier, and what he chose to say would send me into the rain toward a car I did not expect. So stay with me as I trace how one birthday drew a hard line through my family, and who was waiting on the other side. The room that had been warm a moment ago now felt cold, the air taut like a wire ready to snap. My friends looked between us, uncertain, sensing something but not understanding. I kept my hands under the table, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails pressed into my palms. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder as we stepped across the polished marble floor. That small gesture steadied me more than any words could. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavier, sharpened by the echo of shoes striking the wood floor and the rustle of papers being arranged. The benches creaked under the weight of strangers and familiar faces who had come to watch. I took my place at the front table. My heart beat against my ribs, each thump reminding me that this moment was real. Across the room, Victor sat upright, his suit jacket buttoned too tightly, his hands folded on the table before him. He looked straight ahead, only glancing my way once his jaw set, as if he could grind the day down by sheer will. I lowered my gaze to the folder in front of me and papers stacked neatly and waited for the proceedings to begin. When the judge entered the room, rose together, and then sat in unison, the sound of wood scraping the floor filling the silence. My uncle, who had agreed to represent us, stood calmly. His voice carried across the room, not loud but firm. He began by presenting the bank records and the documents that showed how Victor had forged signatures. He explained how my mother had been pressured into signing agreements that stripped her of authority. He laid out the timeline clearly, step by step, without raising his voice. The judge nodded as he listened, and the clerk marked each exhibit into evidence. My throat tightened as photographs were passed to the front. They were familiar pieces of mail and handwritten notes I had once discovered, folded away evidence that tied me back to my family and my name. One letter had been written in my mother's hand. I had stared at it for nights before deciding to bring it forward. Now it lay on the judge's desk, its quiet truth stronger than any speech. Across the room, Victor's composure began to shift. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands pressed harder together until his knuckles whitened. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered, but Victor only stared at the table, his lips pressed thin. I kept my eyes forward, listening as my uncle spoke with the steadiness of someone who believed that truth did not need embellishment. The sound of the clerk opening the side door made the room stir. A woman stepped inside, and the murmur of the spectators rose. I recognized her only from what I had been told. She had once been close to Victor. Her eyes moved quickly around the room before she walked toward the witness stand. My heart raced, not from excitement, but from the certainty that the moment I had feared was here. That night, my 20th birthday, was no longer about candles and laughter. She clutched her bag with both hands until the bailiff asked her to set it down. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but the words came out clear enough for all to hear. She described how Victor had used her trust to move papers through, how she had been asked to sign documents she did not fully understand, and how those papers had later been used to validate false agreements. She paused often, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if reluctant to meet Victor's eyes. Each pause made her testimony feel heavier, not lighter. The judge listened without interruption. My uncle asked her to clarify certain dates, and she did so with careful precision. The silence in the room grew dense, broken only by the scratching of pens and the faint hum of the air system. I glanced at Victor. His jaw was tight, his chest rising more quickly now. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his glasses. At last, Victor could no longer remain seated. He stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and his voice rose, cutting through the heavy air. He shouted that everything was lies, that I was not really his sister, that I had only returned to claim what was not mine. His words were raw, more desperate than commanding. The judge struck the gavel firmly against the desk and ordered silence. The sound echoed through the chamber, drawing the room back into order. I kept my eyes fixed on the folder before me, though my hands trembled slightly on my lap. My uncle did not raise his voice. He simply reached for the last envelope in his stack and handed it to the clerk. Inside were the results of the genetic test, a record that confirmed my place in the family. Alongside it were notarized documents affirming my right to inherit what had been left to me. The judge studied them carefully, his brow furrowed, and then set them aside with the others. The room seemed to lean forward together, the air suspended. Victor's breathing grew heavier. He sat back down, his hands spread flat on the table, and looked straight ahead as if refusing to see the faces around him. His shoulders lifted and fell once, as though he were trying to gather himself. The judge conferred briefly with the clerk, pages shifting, then returned his gaze to the room. The stillness that followed was absolute. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was clear and carried across the chamber without effort. He said that based on the evidence presented, the rightful inheritance and legal recognition belonged to me, Aria Collins. He said that the actions taken to falsify signatures and claim assets would be subject to a separate investigation. It was about the truth I had long tried to ignore, finally rising to the surface, ready to break the silence that had ruled our home for years. Victor's eyes locked on me across the table, steady and unblinking. His words settled like final stones placed into place, undeniable and immovable. I closed my eyes for a moment. My brother's hand tightened gently on my shoulder. A tear escaped before I could stop it, not out of triumph, but from the release of something long carried. Around me, the rustle of movement resumed as the spectators shifted, whispering quietly. My mother, seated just behind, pressed a handkerchief to her lips. She did not speak, but I saw the relief in the softening of her face. The gavel struck once more, and the session was adjourned. People began to file out, the sound of footsteps filling the room again. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the truth settle in. It was not just about inheritance or property. It was about finally being seen for who I was without question or denial. It was about the quiet certainty that the years of silence had not been for nothing. When I opened my eyes again, Victor was still seated across the room, his face turned away. I did not search for his expression. The judgment had been spoken, and the path ahead would be decided by others now. I stood slowly, gathered my folder, and let my brother guide me toward the door. Outside, the light had shifted. The sky was no longer gray, but carried the pale brightness of late morning. I breathed it in and felt the first traces of ease in my chest. When the session ended, I stepped out of the courtroom and into the light of midday. The sun rested warm on my face, brighter and kinder than the stormy night years ago when I had been sent away on my birthday. I stood still for a moment and let the air fill my lungs. At the doorway, my brother waited. His eyes were rimmed with red, but the look he gave me was steady, almost proud. He reached out, and I let my hand rest in his for a brief second before we walked together toward the steps. Behind us, Victor was escorted away. His voice carried back down the hallway, sharp words spoken into a space that no longer belonged to him. I watched the scene without trembling. What I felt was not satisfaction, only the plain recognition that he had carved out this path himself, and now he had to walk it. To my left, the woman who had testified against him left the courthouse too. She walked with her chin lifted, shoulders squared, in a way that suggested she was lighter than when she had entered. Watching her step into the daylight felt like its own quiet justice. I lingered on the steps as people dispersed into the city. My mother moved slowly toward me, her posture bent with fatigue. When she reached me, she reached out a trembling hand and caught mine. Her fingers were thin and unsteady. She said my name softly, and then her voice caught. They carried no warmth, no hesitation, only an unspoken decision that made my stomach twist. My hands, still resting in my lap, gripped each other until my knuckles ached. I knew something was coming, but even then I wasn't prepared for the words he finally released into the silence. She told me she was sorry. She told me she had not protected me the way she should have. Her eyes searched mine, wet and unsure. I did not answer at once. The pause stretched long enough for her to lower her gaze. A tear slipped down my cheek, and only then did I nod. I did not have words to smooth away what had been lost, and I did not want to pretend I did. But in that nod, there was an opening, a small signal that we might find a way forward together. The ache inside me did not vanish, but I no longer felt like I was standing alone in it. That evening, I traveled with my brother back to his home in San Francisco. The drive was long, the city lights giving way to open roads, and in that time neither of us spoke much. Silence felt easier than forcing conversation. When we arrived, his house welcomed us with the faint glow from the porch. Inside, the warmth of his kitchen wrapped around me. The smell of something baking filled the air, cinnamon and sugar lingering from earlier in the day. We sat at the table with mugs of tea. He studied me for a moment before reaching across to take my hand. His hand was warm and steady. He said that from this day on, I would never have to carry the weight alone. His voice was calm, not a promise made to impress, but one spoken like a fact. For a moment, my chest loosened and I allowed myself to believe him. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, listening to the quiet of the neighborhood. It was a different quiet than the one I had grown up with. This one was soft, filled with the distant hum of cars and the occasional bark of a dog, but underneath it was a sense of safety. I thought back to the girl I had been on my 20th birthday, standing in the rain after being told I did not belong. I thought about the years in between, about silence, hesitation, and the choice to finally return. And in that stillness, I spoke the words that had been waiting inside me all along. I lost a house, but I found a family that feels real. I lost years I can never reclaim, but I found justice and a place to stand. Family is not only the people who share your name or your blood. Family is the ones who never let you face the night by yourself. The room froze the instant my brother rose to his feet. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor cut through the lingering laughter like a sharp edge. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, glasses lowered halfway, smiles fading into wary silence. The only sound left was the faint tick of the wall clock, each second dragging heavy against my chest. Victor's eyes found me across the table, steady and unblinking. They carried no warmth, no hesitation, only an unspoken decision that made my stomach twist. My hands, still resting in my lap, gripped each other until my knuckles ached. I knew something was coming, but even then I wasn't prepared for the words he finally released into the silence. "You are not my sister. You never belonged to this family." His voice was calm, deliberate, but each word hit the air with the weight of finality. It was not anger, not even raised yet. It sliced through the room more deeply than if he had shouted. I felt the words strike my chest cold and certain, leaving me with nothing to grasp. The room fell utterly quiet. For a heartbeat, I thought perhaps I had misheard, but the expressions around me confirmed otherwise. Friends who had moments before been laughing now sat stiff, eyes darting from him to me. My heart plummeted, as if the ground beneath me had opened. I turned instinctively to my mother. She sat with her hand covering her mouth, eyes wide and trembling. Her fingers shook against her lips, but she did not speak. She didn't deny him, didn't correct him, didn't move. The lights in our Los Angeles home glowed brighter than usual, strings of bulbs draped across the living room, and kitchen bouncing reflections off the polished wooden floor. I searched her face for reassurance, for a flicker of protest, but all I found was fear and emptiness that felt even sharper than my brother's words. One of my closest friends, Claire, shifted in her chair beside me. I felt her hand brush my arm, a silent offer to intervene, but I shook my head quickly, barely able to lift my eyes. I could not let anyone else stand in the way of what was unfolding. This humiliation, as unbearable as it was mine alone to endure. Victor did not stop. He bent down, picked up a black duffel bag that had been placed neatly beside his chair, as though prepared long before, and dropped it at my feet. The thud of it against the floor echoed in the still room. "This is all you have," he said, his lips curving in a faint, humorless smile. "From now on, you're out of this house. And don't forget, you have no claim, no inheritance. Everything belongs to me." The cruelty of his words lay not in volume, but in their matter-of-fact delivery, as if he were simply stating the rules of a game I had already lost. The whispers started slowly, then grew louder around the table. My friends, unsure whether to leave or to stay, exchanged uneasy glances. Some stared at me with pity, others looked away embarrassed by what they had witnessed. Their murmurs only magnified the burning in my cheeks, though inside I felt nothing but cold. I stared at the bag on the floor, my belongings stuffed into it without care, reduced to a single package handed off, as if I were being dismissed from a place I had once called home. My throat tightened, words caught and unable to rise. The silence inside me was louder than anything in that room. Finally, I bent down, fingers trembling as I reached for the bag. The zipper was half undone, and I glimpsed the corner of a sweater, the edge of an old book. My hand shook so badly I could hardly lift it. My friends' eyes bore into me, their pity heavy, but I kept my gaze low, my movements mechanical. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity this was not just a fight between siblings, not just an argument that could be patched over. Something fundamental had broken. My 20th birthday, the day meant to open a future, had instead closed every door I thought I had. As I straightened, the weight of the bag pulling against my arm, I felt the life I had known slipping further away. My heart still beat fast, but it was not from hope or excitement. It was the rhythm of loss, of a certainty collapsing. That night was no longer about growing older or celebrating with friends. A vanilla cake sat neatly in the center of the dining table, its candles already half melted, giving off a faint sugary smoke that mingled with the scent of fried chicken and garlic bread. Friends crowded around, laughter echoing against the high ceiling, their voices overlapping cheerful light. It had become the night I was cast out, stripped not only of belonging, but of the illusion that I ever had a secure place here. The door closed behind me with a dull thud, the sound heavy and final. In my arms was the duffel bag that had been dropped at my feet only minutes earlier. The echoes of music and laughter still floated faintly from inside, muffled by the thick wooden door, as if mocking the silence waiting for me outside. The rain was steady, pouring down hard enough to blur the glow of the streetlights, each drop stinging against my skin like a reminder that I no longer belonged anywhere. The houses on the block stood quiet, windows glowing with warm yellow light. Inside, families gathered around their tables, the clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversations hidden behind glass. That ordinary comfort, so close in distance, felt unbearably distant to me. I hugged the bag closer to my chest, its weight awkward and dampening against my clothes. Rain soaked through my hair and down my back within moments. My sneakers squelched with every step as I moved away from the house I had once called home. I had no destination, only the instinct to keep walking, to put space between myself and the humiliation that had unfolded. The sound of my shoes hitting puddles mixed with the drumming of rain on the pavement, the world around me reduced to water darkness and the raw thud of my heart. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet asphalt. Each breath caught in my throat, uneven, and I realized I was trembling not from the cold alone, but from the swirl of emotions fighting inside me. Part of me wanted to turn back, to storm through that door and demand answers. I wanted to look my mother in the eye and ask her why she said nothing, why her silence cut deeper than my brother's words. I wanted to shout at Victor, to tell him he couldn't erase me so easily, that no declaration could undo the years I had lived under that roof. But my legs carried me forward, one heavy step at a time, because I knew that if I stopped, I would collapse right there on the wet ground. I remembered other nights, smaller moments of exclusion. The way Victor would look at me when I joined conversations, the pause that always followed my words, the way he seemed to relish reminding me of what I lacked. I smiled when they looked at me, accepted their hugs and the clinking of glasses, but inside, I felt the weight of something else. My mother flitted about, setting plates, checking the drinks, adjusting the flowers she had placed near the cake. I remembered how Mother's eyes sometimes drifted away when I asked simple questions about my father, how her hands would tremble slightly as she stirred a pot or folded laundry. All of those scattered memories, things I had dismissed as quirks of family life, now returned with sharper edges. They lined up in my mind like pieces of a puzzle that had always been waiting to be assembled. The bag thudded against my hip as I adjusted it, water dripping from its straps. Inside were the only things I had been allowed to take: clothes, a book, maybe a toothbrush. Everything else, every sign that I had ever lived in that house, had been erased in one motion. It felt like my entire life had been reduced to a bundle carried in the rain. The streets grew emptier as I walked farther. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights slicing through the downpour, spraying water onto the curbs. None slowed for me. My reflection flickered briefly in the windows of parked cars, hair plastered to my face, clothes clinging to my body, a figure that barely looked like me. My throat tightened again, and this time tears broke free, mixing with the rain already streaming down my cheeks. The saltiness of them burned my lips when I inhaled. I kept walking through the world around me, blurred into streaks of gray and white. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble broke the rhythm of the rain. I turned slightly, hearing the steady approach of an engine. Headlights cut across the wet pavement, growing brighter as they neared their beams, scattering into 1,000 points in the droplets falling around me. My body stiffened. The sound of tires moving slowly through puddles filled the silence between my uneven breaths. The light grew stronger until it fell directly on me, casting my shadow long and wavering across the slick street. For a moment I froze where I stood, my bag clutched so tightly to my chest that my fingers ached. My heart pounded faster, each beat loud enough to drown out the rain. I couldn't tell yet if the car meant safety or danger. All I knew was that it had found me in the middle of the night, in the middle of the storm, when I had nowhere left to go. The black car rolled to a stop beside me, its tires splashing water from the gutter. The window lowered slowly, the mechanical hum faint under the rhythm of the rain. Half of a man's face emerged from the shadows, revealed only by the weak glow of a nearby street lamp. His features were sharp, steady, and unfamiliar. His voice followed low and deliberate, each word weighted as it reached me. He asked for my name. Her smile stayed on, but I noticed the stiffness around her mouth, the way her eyes kept darting to the corner where my brother sat. Her movements were too careful, too practiced, as if she were trying to cover up something that might spill over at any moment. I had just turned 20. Not a polite question, but spoken as if he already knew the answer. The sound of it froze me. My grip on the damp duffel bag tightened, my knuckles white against the strap. My heart raced so fast I could hear the pulse in my ears. For a split second I thought about turning away, about running down the street until his headlights vanished behind me. Yet something kept me still, rooted in place between fear and a pull of curiosity I couldn't explain. The man's eyes didn't waver. They held mine with a quiet persistence, as though he had been sent here for me alone. Without another word, he reached into the seat beside him and lifted an envelope. From it, he pulled a worn photograph. He leaned across the car, extending it through the window, the paper edges fluttering slightly in the wet air. I hesitated before taking it, my hands trembling as though the photograph itself carried weight. When I finally held it under the streetlight, the world seemed to tilt. A child stared back at me, bundled in a soft blanket, resting in the arms of a young man with a radiant smile. The child was me. Even through the fading ink and creased lines, I recognized the shape of my face, the curl of my hair, the eyes that mirrored the ones I saw in the mirror every day. I couldn't place the man holding me. His face was too young, frozen in a moment long before memory. But his expression struck something deep inside me, a pride, a warmth, a certainty of belonging. It was the kind of look I had searched for all my life without ever finding. The driver spoke again, his tone calm, unwavering. He said my brother had sent him. My real brother. The words fell like stones, their weight sinking into me before I could even form a thought. My breath caught. The rain that had soaked me moments ago seemed to fade from awareness, the cold forgotten. All I could feel was the pounding in my chest, the sudden rush of questions colliding in my mind. What brother? What truth had been hidden from me all these years? And why tonight? Why here after my life had been shattered in front of so many witnesses? I stared at the photograph again, tracing the faded lines of the man's smile, the way his hand supported the child I had been. A memory stirred, faint and fragile, like a whisper carried from another lifetime. I remembered lying in bed as a child, my mother's voice floating through the dark as she thought I was asleep. She had whispered a name, Marlowe. It had only happened once. That number was supposed to mean possibility and dependence, a threshold between who I had been and who I would become. Yet standing in the middle of the noise, I could already sense the heaviness in the air, the kind that doesn't belong at a birthday celebration. I had been too young to ask, too uncertain, whether it was real or imagined. That name now echoed with piercing clarity, stitched to the photograph I held in my hand. The driver didn't press me, didn't rush to explain. He simply waited, watching as the storm inside me rose and shifted. I could sense the discipline in his stillness, the patience of someone accustomed to letting truth sink in by itself. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stand firm on the wet pavement. The rain ran down my face, mingling with tears I hadn't realized were there. The name Marlowe, the photograph, the stranger's words, they formed a thread that connected pieces of my life I had never understood. I thought of the silence in my mother's eyes when I asked about my father, the hesitation in her voice whenever family history surfaced. I thought of Victor's cruel certainty when he threw me out, as if he knew more than I ever did about where I truly belonged. And now, here was a stranger speaking of a brother I had never known, holding proof in his hands that my existence had been woven into another story entirely. The photograph crinkled in my grip as I clutched it tighter. I couldn't look away from the image of the young man, from the way he had held me, as if I were the most important thing in the world. My mind spun unsteady. but one truth pulsed louder than all others. My life had been built on secrets, and tonight on the wet street where I thought I had lost everything, a door had been pushed open. The driver slid his hand into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a brown envelope, edges frayed and soft from years of being handled. He held it out through the window, his expression steady, as if he knew exactly what he was placing in my hands. I hesitated, my fingers frozen at my side. For a brief moment, I wanted to refuse to walk away and pretend I had never seen him, never heard his words. But my body betrayed me. My hand reached forward trembling and I took it. The paper felt heavier than it should, damp against my palm. I stood under the drizzle, the sound of rain pattering against the roof of his car, and opened the flap with shaky fingers. Inside were several old photographs and a folded letter. The photograph slid into my hand first. In the dim streetlight, I saw myself a small child bundled in a soft blanket resting in the arms of a young man. His smile was wide, his eyes alight with a joy so pure it startled me. I studied the contours of his face, searching for familiarity, but nothing surfaced. He was a stranger. My brother Victor sat at the head of the table apart from the chatter. His arms were folded across his chest, his posture relaxed, but his presence charged the room in a way no one acknowledged directly. His gaze moved slowly, taking in the people, the cake, the laughter. Yet those eyes, hazel deep and unflinching, were my own. The letter came next. The paper was thick, the ink pressed deeply into each line, as if written with a firm, deliberate hand. I unfolded it slowly, afraid of what it might say. My eyes traced the words, "Arya, my sister. I never stopped looking for you. They took you from me, but not a day has passed when I forgot." The letters blurred as tears filled my eyes, spilling down and smearing the ink. My heart lurched, caught between wanting to believe and the fear of being deceived. What if this was some elaborate trick? What if I was clinging to a lie, desperate for a place to belong? My breath came unsteady, fogging in the cold night air. The driver said nothing. He sat in silence, letting the storm inside me rise and fall. His patience unsettled me, as though he understood the weight of the choice pressing on me. I pressed the letter against my chest, the paper damp and soft against my skin. The rain mixed with my tears until I could no longer tell them apart. My shoulders shook, not from the cold, but from the realization that the life I thought I knew might never have been mine at all. The driver still hadn't moved. He simply watched me, his gaze firm but not invasive, as though waiting for me to catch my breath to decide what to do with what I now held. I closed my eyes, pulling the letter closer. For so long I had felt like an outsider in my own home, blaming myself for the silence that lingered between me and my mother, for the disdain in Victor's eyes. Now, with the weight of the envelope in my hands, I understood that the distance had not come from my imagination. It had been woven into the very fabric of my life. Standing in the downpour, the evidence pressed against my heart, I understood that my life had reached a turning point. I might not yet know where this path would lead, but I knew with certainty that the answers to my existence, the family I never knew, the identity I had been denied, were no longer buried. I sank down onto the curb, my legs folding under me as if the strength had drained from them. The letter blurred in my hand, the ink bleeding into the paper as the rain soaked through. Even so, its words echoed in my mind with a clarity that felt almost unbearable. When his eyes landed on me, they didn't soften. It was not hostility expressed aloud, but a watchfulness that made me feel like an intruder in my own home. I tried to keep my attention on my friends. Each line pressed against my chest like a drumbeat, stirring memories I had long buried or convinced myself I had imagined. As I sat there, the storm outside seemed to open a door inward. Memories began to surface, pulling me back to a time when I was no older than 4 or 5. I was playing with a doll whose dress was frayed at the hem. The room was dim but warm, a small place with a lamp in the corner and the faint smell of soap clinging to the air. I remembered the sound of laughter, low, full of life, belonging to a man who lifted me easily into the air. He spun me around until I squealed, then pressed his forehead to mine, whispering something I no longer recalled. That laughter stopped too soon. The man vanished from my life before I could attach meaning to his presence. After that, there was only my mother, pale and weary, and Victor whose eyes carried a sharpness that grew colder as the years passed. I had convinced myself that maybe I had imagined the man that the memory was no more than a dream stitched together by a child longing for warmth. But tonight, with this letter pressed against my chest, I knew better. I remembered asking my mother about my father when I was little. Each time her lips would press together, her hands tightening around whatever she was holding, she would look away, her gaze slipping somewhere far, and her voice trembled when she said there was nothing to tell. I used to think it was grief, the ache of a woman abandoned, and I stopped asking after a while because I didn't want to reopen her wound. But what if it had not been grief at all? What if it had been guilt? What if she was hiding a truth so large it had reshaped my entire life without me knowing? And then came the faintest of recollections, something I had tucked away for years. One night I had woken and crept down the hallway, standing outside my mother's door. Her voice drifted into the darkness, soft and unguarded. She whispered a single name. Marlowe. She said it once, then again, and then silence. At the time, it meant nothing. Tonight, the name burned bright, stitching itself to the letter I held. The pieces fit too neatly to dismiss. The man in my memory, the laughter, my mother's avoidance, Victor's certainty at my birthday. It all pointed to the same truth. A brother existed. A brother who had been searching. And the man I had grown up calling my brother was something else entirely, not a protector, not kin, but the guardian of a lie that had cut me away from who I really was. I wiped the water from my face and